Hello listeners, I Alka Tiwari welcome you all to Ensemble. Today's topic for discussion is Cold War. A clash of very different beliefs and ideology, capitalism versus communism, each held with almost religious conviction, formed the basis of an international power struggle with both sides vying for dominance, exploiting every opportunity for expansion anywhere in the world. The Cold War was a period of economic, political, and military tension between the United States and the Soviet Union from 1945 to 1991. Following the end of the Second World War, complications arose, centering on the shifting of international power. The Soviet Union wanted to acquire additional territory while the United States attempted to limit the gains desired by the Soviets. This battle of ideologies resulted in increased national security, diplomatic tension, and proxy wars between the two powerful nations. There were long-seated differences between the United States and the Soviet Union over ideologies. Communism was the ideology followed by the Soviet Union, which said that everything should be owned by the government and then divided up equally among the people who would then all work for it. The United States was capitalist, which meant that people could own land and businesses and compete for themselves. How the Cold War progressed. Yalta Conference. The United States, United Kingdom, and the Soviet Union met at the Yalta Conference and agreed to divide Germany as well as the city of Berlin into 4 zones, each of which would be occupied by one of the major Allied powers, the Big Four. Potsdam Conference. The beginning of the Cold War is linked to the Potsdam Conference in 1945. The intention of the meeting was to discuss the realignment of the post-war Europe. However, discussions broke down into threads. Iron Curtain. It is a term used to describe the boundary that separated the Warsaw Pact countries from the NATO countries. The Iron Curtain was both a physical and an ideological division that represented the way Europe was viewed after the Second World War. To the east of the Iron Curtain were the countries that were connected to or influenced by the former Soviet Union. This included part of Germany, Czechoslovakia, Poland, Hungary, Bulgaria, and Romania. Truman Doctrine. In 1947, the Truman Doctrine was issued in an attempt to combat the Soviet menace. This policy called for money to be transferred to the Third World nations in an attempt to prevent communist expansion and gain allies in the battle against communism. Marshall Plan, launched in the same year, encouraged funding to reconstruct European nations devastated by the Second World War. The hope was to prevent Soviet subversion into the weakened governments. Berlin Blockade. In 1948, Britain, France, and the United States began to merge their zones of occupation into a unified state. The Soviet Union responded by blocking all access to Berlin in June. With this, Stalin hoped to force the Western powers to either relinquish Berlin to the communists or to end the plan to unify West Germany. Truman avoided a direct confrontation by ordering a massive airlift to West Berlin. Seeing that the Berlin airlift could continue indefinitely, the Russians ended the blockade in May 1949. Signing of the North Atlantic Treaty. Under its terms, the United States, Canada, Great Britain, France, Italy, Belgium, Netherlands, Luxembourg, Portugal, Denmark, Norway, and Iceland agreed that an attack against one country would be treated as an attack against all. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization (NATO) was created in the following year to integrate the military forces of the member states in Europe. NATO was expanded in 1952 to include Greece and Turkey, and the admission of West Germany in 1955 caused the Soviet Union to establish a counterpart to the alliance through the Warsaw Pact. Vietnam War. The Vietnam War was the prolonged struggle between nationalist forces attempting to unify the country of Vietnam under a communist government and the United States attempting to prevent the spread of communism. The Atomic Age. The containment strategy also provided the rationale for an unprecedented arms buildup in the United States. In particular, American officials encouraged the development of atomic weapons like the ones that had ended the Second World War. Thus began a deadly arms race. In 1949, the Soviets tested an atom bomb of their own. In response, President Truman announced that the United States would build an even more destructive atomic weapon, the hydrogen bomb or super bomb. The space race. Space exploration served as another dramatic arena for Cold War competition. On October 4, 1957, a Soviet R-7 intercontinental ballistic missile launched Sputnik, the world's first artificial satellite and the first man-made object to be placed into the Earth's orbit. In 1958, the US launched its own satellite, Explorer 1, designed by the US Army, and the space race was underway. That same year, National Aeronautics and Space Administration (NASA) was created, while the Soviets launched the first man into space in April 1961 and on Moon in 1969. Cuban Missile Crisis. The United States and the Soviet Union began developing intercontinental ballistic missiles, and in 1962, the Soviets began secretly installing missiles in Cuba that could be used to launch nuclear attack on the US. This sparked the Cuban Missile Crisis, a confrontation that brought the two superpowers to the brink of war before an agreement was reached to withdraw the missiles. Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. The two superpowers soon signed the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty of 1963, which banned above-ground nuclear weapons testing. The close of the Cold War. Almost as soon as he took office, President Richard Nixon began to implement a new approach to international relations. Instead of viewing the world as a hostile, bipolar place, he suggested, why not use diplomacy instead of military action to create more poles? To that end, he encouraged the United Nations to recognize the Communist Chinese government. At the same time, he adopted a policy of détente, relaxation towards the Soviet Union. In 1972, he and Soviet Premier Brezhnev signed the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, SALT I, which prohibited the manufacture of nuclear missiles by both sides and took a step towards reducing the decades-old threat of nuclear war. When Mikhail Gorbachev became General Secretary of the Communist Party of Soviet Union, he launched his nation on a dramatic new course. His dual program of perestroika and glasnost introduced huge changes in the economic practice, internal affairs, and international relations. Within 5 years, Gorbachev's revolutionary program swept communist governments throughout Eastern Europe from power and brought an end to the Cold War. The largely political and economic rivalry between the Soviets and the United States and their respective allies that emerged following the Second World War was over. Gorbachev's actions also set the stage for the 1991 collapse of the Soviet Union, which dissolved into 15 individual republics. The Berlin Wall was a symbol throughout the whole Cold War, representing the war itself and communism. The falling of the wall symbolized the end of the Cold War and the end of the Iron Curtain's dominance. That will be all for now. Thank you.